Alright, so what we have here is a YouTube app that allows us to add YouTube's or save YouTube bookmarks, something like that. Alright, so let's say we go to a YouTube channel and we let's copy a URL here, copy link, and we can put it here, press save. So we have a little message, YouTube link save, and you can see it shows up here. And then what we could do is we could also edit one of the URLs. So we say edit in video, and then we can give it a new URL. So we copy a link here and we press save. So this should update this one here, and then we could also delete a URL. So let's say we wanted to delete the last one, we press delete and that should disappear. Alright, so this was created with Vue.js. So let's actually get into the backend code. Alright, so the first thing to focus on is our Vue object here. So we have app, new Vue object, and we have the ID, the app. ID app, right? So that's the first thing to pay attention to. Next, we're going to focus on the input and the button. Alright, so let's look at the input and the button. So the input, we have a vModel and user URL, so that's the input. And the button is the on-click add URL. Alright, so let's look at those. So user URL is a variable and add URL is a function. So user URL we define in the data object when we create our Vue object, and add URL is this. Alright, so what add URL basically does is it takes whatever URL you enter and it converts it to an embedded type of URL, and then it saves it to the database. So since we mentioned database, we're just looking at the database here. So if I wanted to say send to and create, you can see we just have two things there, the ID and the URL, and all our URLs are within here. So that's our database. So you notice we have something called sync changes and sync edits. So these are requests we make to the server. So sync changes is what allows us to save the URL. So what we actually call it is a fetch function, the JavaScript fetch function. We call it a URL, or the request to the server is api.php with an action sync link. So we can look at that from the server side. Alright, from the server side, we see what we get in here. We have sync links, and we get in all the links we pass. Of course, there's only just one, but it could, initially I had it as I could allow to add many, but right now we're just taking one. And so if we're saying for each link we want to insert into YouTube bookmarks database, and then we return in the object, we return an ID and URL. So that allows us to, first we get the data. First we fetch the data, and we use the form data object here and append in URLs, and brackets means multiple, right? And then we can get the data as JSON and push it to our this.urls. Alright, so that's one thing we didn't focus. So when I refresh this page, what we do immediately is that we pull all the data from our server, right? So the request that does that is called, let's see what we have here. It's called get links, right? And we call it the created function of the Vue object. So get links, all it does is fetches all the bookmarks, right? So we have fetch api.php, and it returns, and it assigns all the data to this.url. So this URLs have all our data. Let's just look at it on the server side. Get links. Get links should be pretty simple. It just get links is right here, right? So select all the bookmarks and return them. Of course, we convert it to this function, and then we use a JSON response, which is a custom function that allows us to return JSON. So we have our header, and we have a kind of format here where we take the response, we have a message and a status, and the actual data if you wanted to use that. Alright, so JSON response is a custom function. Alright, so edit and delete. Alright, so when we press edit, it has a notification here that says edit in the video, and then we can add the link. So let's just look at that. So the edit function, we're going back to our YouTube HTML page. The edit function is called using. Alright, so there's one thing we need to look at again. So remember, this URL, this.url is the variable that will in this. I just want to show you how we display these actual items, right? So Within this, we have a div called div YouTube block, and this is what I'm showing you here. And v4 is a for loop in Vue, and URL is the individual URL object, and URLs is the dis.urls that we assigned it to. So URLs here, remember when we call get URLs, we assigned dis.urls. all right, so we have all the URLs, and we just looping through the data, and each one is an iframe with the correct YouTube link, and then we have the edit and delete functions, delete buttons and functions. So edit URL, when we press edit URL, what we're actually doing is we say this.edit message is true and this active ID, and then we also display a notification. All right, so edit message is a variable that allows us to say is a true or false variable. Edit message is true or false, right? And based on that, we say we have if here. So if it is true, we show edit a video, otherwise it is false. We also do this for the cancel edit. If it is true, we show cancel edit, otherwise it is false. All right, so we could cancel edit, and then we can just press edit, and we see that editing video shows up and cancel edit shows up. So to edit a video, we just have to put in a new URL here, and then if we were to go to the edit URL function, well, that's all it does. And then we have to press save link, and save link does two things, right? So going back to save link calls the add URL function, right? So in add URL function, we realize we have this active ID. So if active ID has a value, that means we in the edit mode, and then we could call sync edit. And what sync edit does is it takes the ID and calls the update links function. This is the request to the API, and then it gets back the response. So let's just look at update links. So we see update links here, where we get the ID and we get the URL that we updating. We call the update YouTube bookmark set URL is equal to ID, and then we return the values. All right, and delete does a similar thing. So we're just going to delete calls the send delete requests, and we can see this here, fetch API delete links. All right, so delete does a similar thing where we just send the ID and we delete it using our SQL query, and once we do that, we're good to go. All right, so once you decide that you want to edit a link, I just want to show you something. So when we press edit and we copy the link here and we press save, only this value is updated. So how we do this, and again, I don't know if there's the right way to do it, but how we do this is, for example, for edit links, where we have sync edit, what we do is, even though we get in one response, so this response here, this data dash response is just one object that we're receiving from the server, and we map in this URLs, and we check in file at a specific ID, we change it that specific ID alone, and then we return back all the URLs. So we have a temp URLs here, and then we assign this URL to the temp URL. So basically what we do is we go through all the URLs and assign temp URLs differently. So if it is equal to the ID from the server, then we change the link. Otherwise, we just assign it as normal, and then we assign the temp URLs to this URLs. We clear temp URLs, so that allows us to only edit one of the variables, one of the objects in our object array. And we do the same thing for add-in, I guess, kind of. So add URLs, we do the same thing for sync changes. It's probably less complicated because we only need to add. So we push the data that we get from the server, right? So that's all we do. We're just pushing the data that we get from the server. To me, this should work without me having to actually define ID and URL, but maybe I'm making a mistake there. It's not my first time working with Vue, but this is the actual first application that I built out fully. All right, so this is our Vue application. Again, for notifications, we're just using a pure JavaScript function called notification.js, and we had to define the constants here, and then we have a my success notif and a my error notif, and then we we can display them just adding a title and a message. So that is actually pretty cool. So you just show it there and it looks pretty good. Alright, so this is our small YouTube app. It's one HTML page. We add the Vue script up here. Then we have our notification.js, and we also have our font awesome there. Alright, so did we cover everything? Cancel edit. This is the cancel edit function. We just set back ID as being null and edit message as being false. Alright, we no longer using this. This was what we was using to remove our bookmark initially. Yeah, so that's it.